All right, so this is the lecture over the Civil War. There we go. The American Civil War is often called the first modern war. We had never seen in the U.S. We'd never seen a war where such huge armies were amassing on the battlefield. We'd never seen such deadly weapons. Many of them were created by or as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And so the casualties caused in these battles by these weapons just dwarfed anything that the U.S. had ever seen before. And the war started with both sides kind of thinking of it in a traditional way. It's a battle of army versus army. But it very quickly becomes obvious that this is really a war of society versus society. And in that kind of war, the distinction between military and civilian targets blurs or disappears. And so the steadiness of your leadership and the ability to mobilize and your society's willingness to keep up the fight are honestly more important than the outcome of any individual battle. Now, almost any comparison between the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South, the Confederacy which secedes, any comparison between those two favored the Union. The population of the North and the loyal border states, those slave states that didn't secede, the population of those states combined was about 22 million people in 1860. In the Confederacy, there were only about 9 million, and 3.3 million of them were slaves. In terms of manufacturing, the North has more. Financial resources, the North has more. Railroad miles, the Union far outstrips the Confederacy. The Union had 2.5 times as many miles of rail as the Confederacy did. 21,000 miles of rail in this little map up here. In the Union, compared to not quite 8,500 miles in the Confederacy. Now, on the other hand, the Union has a much bigger job than the Confederacy. In order to restore the entire nation, it has to invade and conquer an area that's about as large as Western Europe. You remember when we did the Revolution, all of the advantages that the U.S. had during the Revolution. Fighting on their own land, near and protecting home and family, fighting for this cause that inspires some devotion. In the Civil War, those were Confederate advantages. On their own land, near home and family, the cause on both sides inspired devotion. But Confederate soldiers were very motivated. And like Washington's army in the Revolution, they can afford to lose battles as long as they keep fighting long enough to tire out their opponent. Now, on both sides, the outbreak of war stirred up all of this patriotic feeling. Recruits rushed to enlist. They expected this short, glorious war. They'd be home by Christmas. After the first few battles, that enthusiasm is going to wane considerably, and both sides will resort to drafting soldiers. The Confederacy passed the first draft law in U.S. history by the spring of 1862. In 63, the North followed them. By the end of the war, more than 2 million men had served in the U.S. Army. 900,000 had served in the Confederate Army. And both of those military forces was like a cross-section of the society that it had come from. The South's army was mostly non-slave-owning small farmers, with slave owners dominating the officer corps. In the North, the army is mostly farm boys and shopkeepers and artisans and factory workers. Very few recruits on either side had any military experience, and their ideas about war were very romantic. One private wrote home in 62 that everything he knew about combat had come from the pictures of battle that he had seen. But the problem was, until the Civil War, battlefield photography barely existed. There were a handful of pictures of the Mexican War from the Mexican War, but they weren't of actual battle. They were from the occupation of the city of Saltillo. The earliest battlefield pictures were made in the 1850s in Romania. The average American would not have seen them. The pictures of battle that everyone knew were painted long after the fact and never gave the truth of what battle looks like or sounds like or smells like. And neither the soldiers nor their officers were really prepared for the way that all of this new technology had transformed the war, and to some extent they had a very hard time figuring out how to take best advantage of these new technologies. The Civil War is the first conflict in the U.S. where the railroad transported troops and supplies. So it's the first where junctions like Atlanta and Petersburg became major military objectives. This is the first time where the U.S. fought with ironclad ships. There was the Union vessel, the Monitor, and the Confederate vessel, the Merrimack, that met in battle in 1862. That was the first demonstration of ironclad ships instead of wooden ships, and it revolutionized naval warfare. This war saw the use of the telegraph for military communication. It saw the use of observation balloons, actually, to fly over enemy lines and see what was going on. And we saw early hand grenades, we saw primitive submarines, very, very primitive submarines. This picture is a cross-section of the H.L. Hunley. It's a Confederate submarine, and it's the only one that actually made it into battle. But even there, it had a lot of problems. The H.L. Hunley is, as you can see, it's a hand crank. There's no air supply. There's only enough room for 8 men. It was supposed to sink ships by attaching an explosive to the hull of the enemy ship, and then you crank like the dickens to get out of the way before it explodes. The H.L. Hunley sank 3 times. The first time, 5 of its crew died. The second time, the entire crew died. And the third time, it did manage to damage a Union ship before it sank and killed its entire crew again. It wasn't dredged up off the ocean floor until the 1970s. But probably the most traditional, the most important new technology was a revolution in arms manufacturing. The traditional musket was only accurate at a short range. The modern rifle, though, was deadly at 600 yards or more because of the rifling in the barrel. Rifling is the grooves on the inside of a barrel. That technology had actually been developed back in the 1400s, but it wasn't commonplace until the 1800s. That development changed the nature of combat. Now we start building these fortifications and digging these elaborate trench systems and defensive armies, which in this war is usually going to be the Confederates. They have an advantage over attacking forces. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson said that his men would never fail to hold their position. And he was mostly right. Even better if you could get one. And hardly anyone had these, but if you could get a breech-loading rifle, that was amazing. In most of the firearms of the war, especially if you're poor non-com infantry, mostly the firearms are the muzzle loaders. Muzzle loaders are very slow to load, and worst of all, you have to stand up to do it. Trained musketmen were supposed to be able to fire 3 shots a minute. That means you've got basically 19 seconds to reload, and that was for a very well-trained musketman. Now, 19 seconds doesn't sound that long when you're sitting, comfortably in a recliner or wherever it is you're sitting listening to this, but when you are standing up, which you have to do to load a muzzle loader, when you're in battle, when somebody's shooting at you, you're giving a really awesome target profile to your enemy. 19 seconds is a long time. But if you've got a breech loader, or even better if you've got a revolver, you can keep your butt in the bushes and you have a much better chance at survival. All of these developments produced really appalling casualty statistics. 620,000 men died, and that represents the equivalent in today's population of more than 5 million. The death toll in the Civil War nearly equals the total number of Americans who died in all of our nation's other wars, from the Revolution to the current one. And neither side was really ready for other aspects of modern warfare. Medical care was exceedingly primitive. We talked about what the doctors did to President Taylor, I think, and they weren't any better for soldiers. This is before doctors actually knew that you should wash your hands between patients. So one dude with gangrene can cost a dozen more their legs just because it's been transferred by the doctors. The camps themselves were disgusting disease machines. They didn't know that you shouldn't dig the latrine uphill from the well. Diseases like measles and dysentery and typhus swept through the army camps. More men died of disease than died in combat. The Civil War was also the first war in which a large number of Americans were captured by the enemy and held in military prisons. 50,000 men died in those prisoner of war camps, which were worse than the actual army camps. They died from disease and starvation. The most infamous of those camps was the Confederate prison at Andersonville, Georgia. Nearly 13,000 Union soldiers died just at that one camp, which wasn't even open for 2 complete years. Well, another modern feature of the war was the propaganda efforts that both sides had to try and stir up public opinion. There was an outpouring of souvenirs and songs and pamphlets and lithographs that were issued by patriotic organizations, by the war departments on both sides. They wanted to reaffirm the values of whichever side they were on, and tar the other side with the brush of treason. In the Union, the South was accused of crimes against Union soldiers and loyal civilians, and comparable items appeared in the Confederacy. At the same time, though, the reality of war was brought home to the public at large in a way that they had never seen before. War correspondents, journalists, traveled with the armies, and newspapers reported the results of battle the very next day and were able to quickly publish the casualty lists. Photographs began carrying images of war into millions of American living rooms. Beginning in 1862, photographers went on to the actual battlefields while the battles are going on. Some of them, if they were crazy. They went on to the battlefields to take, at the time, shocking pictures of the Battle of Antietam was the first one. One journalist said they were trying to bring the bodies and lay them in your dooryards. Matthew Brady was the most famous photographer of the war. He trained an entire corps of photographers to cover the battles. The outbreak of war found both sides unprepared. At the start of the war, the Union had so many more miles of rail, but there was no standardized railroad gauge. The gauge is the distance between the 2 tracks, and they were proprietary. So if you've got the Pennsylvania Railroad, they build their gauges to match the width of their trains. And the South Carolina-Georgia Railroad would build their rails, lay their rails to match the width of their trains. But that's not an efficient way to handle a war. So you can't be, putting men and supplies on a train in Ohio, and you get them barely to Indiana, before you have to offload everything and put them on a different train that can use those rails. So one of the first things that the government had to do, in the North at least, was tear up a lot of those miles of rail and standardize them. There was no national banking system on either side. There was no tax system that was even remotely capable of raising the kind of money that either side needed. There weren't even accurate maps of parts of the southern states, which, okay, there were a couple of amusing incidents where you've got Union troops blundering around in the Virginia wilderness, trying to find something to shoot at. Up north, there wasn't agreement on how to fight the war. Lincoln favored the Anaconda Plan. It was developed by Winfield Scott. You remember Winfield Scott from the Mexican War. He's the man who captured Mexico City. The Anaconda Plan was this naval blockade. The U.S. would send our Navy. We would surround the Confederate coastline. Then the Confederates wouldn't be able to get any cotton out to sail or any supplies in. The problem is the southern coastline is 3,500 miles long, and the U.S. only had 90 ships in our entire Navy. Less than half of those ships were steam-powered. I mean, they kept trying this plan. God bless them, they kept trying. But it didn't start to work until relatively late in the war. Then there was the problem of buying and distributing the food and the weapons and all of the other supplies that soldiers need. The Union Army eventually became the best-fed, best-supplied military force in history. Confederate armies, on the other hand, by the third year of the war, they're suffering acute shortages of food and uniforms and shoes. They did have weapons, though, by God. The Confederate Ordnance Chief was actually kind of brilliant and very resourceful at arming Southern troops. Under his direction, the Confederate government imported weapons from abroad, and they built arsenals of their own to make rifles and artillery and ammunition. But you can't eat a musket, and starving men don't aim too well. In the North, there was also a failure of leadership, I guess. The first generals that Lincoln tried to use were bad at utilizing all of the advantages that the Union had in manpower and technology. In April of 61, when the war starts, the regular army, the professional army, only had 15,000 men, and most of them were stationed west of the Mississippi River, way out on the frontier. Their officers were trained to lead small, professional units into battle, not crowds of untrained farm boys. And the North also lacked vision. At first, for way too long, Union officers focused on capturing Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Now, that is how wars used to be fought. You know, you capture the enemy's capital, you force a treaty, everybody goes home. That's how the Mexican War ended. The Civil War wasn't like that. But Union generals didn't realize it. They kept marching toward Richmond, and they would fight if the Confederates were in their way, and if they lost, they would retreat, and if they won, they never really pursued the Confederate army. Some of it was really just not understanding the realities of new warfare, and some of it was just old-fashioned pig-headedness. George McClellan was really bad about that. He wasn't in charge right from the beginning, but when Lincoln did put him in charge of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan believed that wars should be fought like gentlemen, and it is ungentlemanly to pursue a fleeing foe. So, if he won a battle, which TBH was kind of rare, but if McClellan won a battle, he would let the Confederates retreat without chasing them. So, Union generals, for years into the war, will sacrifice their manpower superiority. They will allow the South to concentrate their much smaller forces before battle. Lincoln actually figured out the problem before his generals did. You don't capture the capital. You got to defeat the whole society. Now, in the east of the Mississippi River, there are multiple armies on both sides in the field. The two that we're going to concentrate on is the Army of Northern Virginia, which is the largest Confederate army east of the Mississippi, and the Army of the Potomac, which is the largest Union army east of the Mississippi. They are not the only armies in the field, but they are the largest for their respective sides. Most of the early fighting that these two armies were involved in took place in a very narrow corridor of land between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, which, as the crow flies, are only about 100 miles apart. Now, the Army of the Potomac, these dudes in blue, that's the main Union force. It is led by a revolving door of generals who are all bent on capturing Richmond and all getting turned back over and over again. The first significant engagement was the First Battle of Bull Run. It's also sometimes called First Manassas. The Union and the Confederacy, very confusingly, like to use different naming conventions for their battles. We're going to call it the First Battle of Bull Run because that's the Union name, and the Union won the war. Bull Run Creek is in northern Virginia. It's only about 25 miles from D.C., and this battle, which took place in July of '61, very early in the war, it was supposed to be a milk run for Union troops. It was supposed to be so easy. They were going to crush the Confederates, head on to Richmond, they would be home in time for church on Sunday, and the war would be over. Now, this location is so close to D.C. that members of Congress decided to take their wives and daughters and neighbors out and have a nice picnic lunch on the hills overlooking the battlefield. They would wave their little flags, they would cheer on the nice boys, and then they would have the best stories when they went back to town. At the start of the battle, the Union had about 7,000 more troops than the Confederates did, so easy peasy. But the battle turned into a rout. And a rout is not a retreat. A retreat suggests good military order. A rout is absolute bloody chaos. And that's what this was for the Union. Most of these kids, and they were kids, they're 17, 18, 19 years old. They've never been shot at before. They really don't have the training to know what to do when they're shot at. And then very quickly, reinforcements for the Confederates arrive. They don't like seeing that nonsense at all. So they turned tail. They ran until they hit the wagons, with the Confederates right behind them. The oxen pulling the wagons got spooked. They started heading back to D.C., straight up the hills, where the congressmen and their families and their carriages are waiting. It was a mess. Those congressmen and their families got a view of war that they never forgot. Almost 800 men died at First Bull Run. By the end of the war, that number's going to be peanuts. But in 1861, 800 men was more than the death toll of any previous American battle. And both sides came away with this sinking realization that this war is not going to be the brief, glorious lark that they thought it would be. In the wake of Bull Run, Lincoln put George McClellan in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Now, McClellan had his good points. He's an Army engineer. He's very good at that. He's pretty good at training, actually. Whipped his men into what could have been a superb fighting force if he'd let them fight. He really didn't like to fight, though. He would have much preferred keeping his men at a distance from the actual battles. So in that way, he would probably have been more comfortable with combat in the 21st century. But in the 1860s, you can't press a button and blow something up 100 miles away. You gotta get up close and personal, and McClellan was just not good at that. McClellan was not a great strategist, and he was very cautious, and he had this tendency to overestimate the size of the Confederate force that he didn't want to fight. And once the Confederates figure that out, they become really good at exploiting that. There was one short McClellan story. The Siege of Yorktown. There was Yorktown in the Revolutionary War. There's another siege of Yorktown here in the Civil War. At Yorktown, it is being held by the Confederates. The Confederate general inside Yorktown, Magruder, he has maybe 13,000 men. McClellan, with the Union Army outside of town, has about 121,000 men. So it should have been, even for McClellan, it should have been a really easy job to take Yorktown. But General Magruder tricked McClellan into thinking that he had far more men than he actually did have. He used a little trick that Tecumseh had used during the War of 1812. They built a fortified line a few miles out from the city with these artillery posts, and Magruder would send a large contingent of his men marching past these posts, and then they would circle back around and they would march past again, and then they would circle around and march past again. And the guys counting them, the Union officers trying to count them, concluded that Magruder probably had not 13,000 men, but closer to 115,000, 120,000 men. So McClellan is not going to attack that size of a force, even though he's still got more. Instead of attacking, he digs in for a siege. They've got these earthworks, and they spend like a month working on these entrenchments around the city, and finally he sends an observation balloon over Yorktown and discovers that the entire town is empty. Magruder used that month to send his men and supplies out of Richmond, or out of Yorktown to Richmond, then came back for civilians, then came back for the livestock. And in all that time, McClellan is very industriously outside the city, digging these trenches, planning the siege. And so yeah, that was embarrassing. McClellan was also a Northern Democrat, which was increasingly rare, and was notably racist. And this isn't me saying this from 2018, because everybody in 1860 was racist from our point of view. This is something that was talked about by McClellan's own contemporaries, by his fellow officers, by his fellow politicians, by his friends. Do you know how racist you gotta be for white people in 1860 to notice that you're being racist? He does not support this war. He does not want slavery to be abolished. He's really not the guy that Lincoln should have put in charge here. But so it's not really until the spring of 62, after a growing demand for action by Lincoln, that McClellan really led his army into Virginia. The Army of the Potomac, under McClellan, confronts the smaller Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee. Lee was kind of everything that McClellan wasn't. He was a brilliant battlefield tactician. Lincoln actually offered Lee command of the Army of the Potomac, but Lee chose to commit treason instead. His devotion to the state of Virginia outweighed the vow that he had made to the United States. Lee comes from an old Virginia family. One of his ancestors was in the House of Burgesses. One of them signed the Declaration of Independence. Lee is a slave owner. He talks about his conflicts over slavery. He says it's an awful sin, and he will definitely free all of his slaves once he's got his finances in order. But he never actually freed anyone. Lee met McClellan's forces in what's called the 7 Days Campaign. That is a series of battles on the peninsula south of Richmond. Lee, even though he's got a numerically inferior force, forced McClellan to withdraw almost all the way back to D.C. In August of that year, Lee had another victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Then Lee decided that it wasn't enough for him to be a successful defender. Defending will tire out your opponent eventually, but it'll take a while. And so Lee kind of thinks if he can go on the offensive, if he can win a decisive victory in the North itself, then maybe the Northern public will stop supporting the war. maybe it will end more quickly. He also hoped that he might be able to force the border states to join the Confederacy, and maybe even capture D.C. itself. But the border states are states where slavery was legal, but did not join the Confederacy. So slavery is legal in Kentucky, but they never seceded. It's legal in Missouri and Maryland and Delaware, but they never seceded either. In fact, Maryland probably would have seceded, but Lincoln severely cracked down on political rights, civil liberties in Maryland, specifically to keep the pro-Confederates from taking control, because there is no way he can deal with having D.C. in the middle of the Confederacy with Virginia on one side and Maryland on the other. So in September of 1862, Lee invaded the North. He met McClellan's forces at the Battle of Antietam, which is about 55 miles from D.C. In that battle, in that day, 4,300 men were killed. 18,000 were wounded. 2,000 of those will later die of their injuries. One survivor said that the dead lay 3 deep in the fields, mowed down like grass before the sun. More Americans died on that day, September 17, 1862, than on any other day in U.S. history, including D-Day, including September 11th. In fact, more American soldiers died at Antietam than died in all of the other complete wars fought by the United States during the entire 19th century. If you add up the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, still fewer dead than in that one battle. Antietam remains the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. The worst part of the battle lasted, about 3.5 hours, from like 9:30 in the morning to about 1 p.m., along an 800-yard stretch of road that today we call the Bloody Lane. 5,600 men were killed or injured in 3.5 hours along the length of 8 football fields. It's 27 casualties every minute. And allegedly, if you visit the Antietam battlefield today, they will tell you that the Bloody Lane is haunted. Lee was forced to retreat, so the North was able to say, hey, we won. In reality, it was more of a draw, but since Lee ran first, we got to claim it. That will be the Union's last success for a long while in the East. Lincoln was furious with McClellan after this battle, because McClellan let Lee retreat. McClellan still had 60,000 men who were able to fight. Lee had less than half that, and McClellan let him run. Lincoln replaced McClellan for the first time, replaced him with Burnside. Ambrose Burnside, one of the least liked commanders in the Union Army. Burnside attacked Lee at Fredericksburg, Virginia, in such a dumb, badly planned attack that several of Burnside's junior officers just flat tried to refuse to obey. And after the battle, which the Union lost badly, Burnside demanded that those subordinate officers be court-martialed or he would resign. And Lincoln said, resign? Put him in an admin commission out in Ohio, and put Joe Hooker in charge of the Army of the Potomac. So this is now the 6th change of command for the Army of the Potomac. Start with Winfield Scott, then Burnside, then Pope. Winfield Scott, then McClellan, then Pope, then McClellan again, then Burnside, and then Hooker. And that's just the official changes of command. While the Union is busy not really accomplishing much in the East for the first couple years of the war, events out west were more encouraging. Out west, near Mississippi, we've got the Army of the Tennessee. And there is an Army of the Tennessee on the Confederate side, and a different Army of the Tennessee on the Union side, which is super confusing. They were not considering the needs of future history students when they named these armies. So we're just going to talk about the Union Army of the Tennessee. The Union Army of the Tennessee is commanded by Ulysses Grant. Grant was a West Point graduate, served in the Mexican War with distinction, resigned from the Army in the 1850s because he had a little problem with the bottle. When the Civil War broke out, he immediately enlisted. He was commissioned as a colonel in the Illinois Regiment and began to display the logic and the observation skills that served him well for this war. One of the things that Grant was really good at was learning from other people's mistakes. But it wasn't just that. He reviewed reports of other battles and how Confederate officers would react to stimuli. It's very scientific here. So he would review like what happened down at Antietam, and if McClellan did this, then Lee would do this. So then he learned, if you want Lee to do that, then this is the stimuli that you give him. He became really good at that. In February of '62, Grant won the Union's first significant victory when he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. In April of '62, the Navy steamed into New Orleans, took control of the South's largest city, the plantation economy that surrounded that. At the same time that New Orleans fell, Grant withstood a surprise attack at Shiloh, Tennessee. And then Union momentum in the West stalled as well. And so Lincoln's got to think of something new to try. It's been said that war is the midwife of revolution, and the Civil War produced far-reaching changes in American life. The most important of those was the destruction of slavery, the central institution of Southern economics and society and politics. Between 1831, when the Brits abolished slavery in their empire, and the 1880s, when Brazil finally outlawed it, 6 million people in the Western Hemisphere gained their freedom. Of those 6 million, 4 million, nearly 2/3 of the total, lived in the southern United States. In numbers and scale and economic power, American emancipation dwarfed any other countries. At the start of the war, Lincoln did not expect or desire that. He talked about these time-honored Northern values. In a message to Congress, he identified the Union cause with the cause of democracy for the family of man. He said this is a people's struggle. But Lincoln kept insisting that slavery was not relevant to this war. In the first year of the war, his major preoccupation was keeping the border states in the Union and building the broadest base of support possible for the war effort. He was afraid that if he took any action against slavery, it would drive the border states, which had more than 2.5 million white people and about 500,000 slaves, would drive them into the Confederacy and might also alienate conservative Northerners. So in the early days of the war, Congress adopted a resolution that said the United States had no intention of interfering with slavery. Northern military commanders were ordered to return runaway slaves to their owners, which raised a massive outcry. Obviously among abolitionists, because that's very immoral, but also among the military commanders themselves. That's stupid, right? If you return slaves to the Confederacy, it helps the Confederacy. The Confederacy used slaves to dig trenches and take care of cavalry horses and other kinds of labor. But if those slaves run away and are not returned, then the Confederates can't use them. By the end of '61, the Union military had adopted this plan of treating escaped slaves not as escaped slaves, but as the contraband of war. Contraband of war is a term in international law. It allows one side in a war to seize property from the other side. and so escaped slaves became known as the contraband. They were housed by the army in contraband camps. Contraband children went to contraband schools. Meanwhile, slaves themselves took action that helped force reluctant white America down the road toward emancipation. Whatever Lincoln said, African Americans saw this war as a chance to end slavery. Well before Lincoln probably even thought the word emancipation. Black people in the North and the South were calling this the Freedom War. In 61 and 62, as the Union Army began to occupy more and more Confederate territory, slaves by the thousands ran to Union lines. And unlike fugitives before the war, these runaways, these refugees, included large numbers of women and children. Entire families would abandon the plantations. Many of them were able to pass along really good military intel and detailed knowledge of the South's geography. General Dan Sickles said that the best information he ever got would come from escaped slaves. Some of them offered to act as guides to Army units in southern Louisiana. When the Union Navy sailed in, slaves started demanding wages in exchange for any future work that they did. One northern reporter wrote that slavery is forever destroyed and worthless in Louisiana, no matter what Mr. Lincoln might have to say on the subject. And one of the most spectacular incidents of African Americans acting as guides actually involved Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was the first American woman to lead a military raid. It was called the Combahee River Raid, and she led Union forces down this river. There were massive plantations with close to 10,000 slaves just within this one small area of the river. She guided the Union Army, or a section of the Union Army, down this river to seize these plantations and free the slaves. And they joined with the Union Army by the thousands. Now, at first, the determination of slaves to seize their freedom was a bit of an embarrassment to Lincoln. It was farther than he wanted to go, and certainly beyond anything that he had said. But since traditional strategies hadn't won the war yet, why not try something new? Anti-slavery Northerners insisted that emancipation was necessary to weaken the South and win the war. Abolitionists and radical Republicans had been the most uncompromising opponents of slavery before the war, and they keep pushing Lincoln to target slavery specifically as a war measure. Thaddeus Stevens was a radical Republican congressman from Pennsylvania. He declared that nothing but abolition would subdue this rebellion. In March of '62, Congress passed a law that would prohibit the Army from returning runaway slaves to their owners, a complete reversal of what they had done in the first year. Then they abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., but they paid slave owners in D.C. for their lost property. Then they abolished slavery in all of the territories. In July of '62, they freed the slaves of disloyal Unionists. So if a slave owner in Missouri is still a Union state, if a slave owner in Missouri joined the Confederate Army or donated money or supplies to the Confederate Army, then his slaves would be freed, assuming that they knew about this congressional order and could get away. And Congress also declared free all slaves who escaped to Union lines. Now, while this is going on during all of these months, Lincoln is trying to stay ahead of this issue, but he's not doing it very well. There was a point where the commander of Union forces in Missouri tried to decree that all Missouri slaves were free. Lincoln freaked the F out. He's afraid that this order will force the whole state to join the Confederacy, so he demanded that General Fremont rescind that freedom order. In November of '61, Lincoln suggested that the border states should work on a plan to gradually free their slaves, with the federal government paying them for their lost property. He started talking about colonization again, sending freed slaves to Africa or the Caribbean. As late as December 62, Lincoln was trying to work up this agreement to settle former slaves on this island off the coast of Haiti. But sometime during the summer of 62, Lincoln came to the conclusion that emancipation was a political and military necessity. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to that. For one thing, we've got the lack of traditional military success. So maybe try something new. There was hope that emancipated slaves would not just not be helpful to the Confederacy, but could meet the Union Army's labor shortage. And also there was a changing opinion of slavery up north. As more Union soldiers, as more Union armies penetrate the South and see the reality of slavery, we do see a slow change in the general Union opinion about slavery. And Lincoln also knew that the Confederacy was trying to reach out to other countries for help, and he wants to stop that. In particular, they want British help. Britain had a lot of cotton textile mills that were standing idle because they were used to having southern cotton and now they can't get it. And the Confederacy was saying, if you help us, you'll have access to our cotton again. Parliament and Queen Victoria, who didn't really have any political power but had a lot of symbolic power, they were wavering over whether to aid the Confederacy. And Lincoln figured, as long as the Civil War is a war about the Confederacy trying to start their own nation, then Britain has no reason not to help the Confederacy. But if he can make this a moral war, if he can make this a war about slavery, which it really wasn't from the Northern perspective at the start of the war, then Britain will have a moral obligation to not help the South. Lincoln didn't want to look desperate, so he delayed his announcement until after a Union victory, and, they didn't have a whole lot of those at first. His first real opportunity was after Antietam. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It warned that unless the Confederacy laid down its arms and stopped fighting by the end of the year, Lincoln would decree abolition in those areas still in rebellion. The Northern reaction to that was not encouraging. In the congressional elections in '62, Northern Democrats, there were still a handful of them, they ran campaigns against emancipation. They said the North will be Africanized, freed slaves will compete for jobs, and they'll drive down wages, and they'll marry white women, and so the Republican Party suffered. They lost control of the legislature in Illinois and Indiana. The governor of New York became a Democrat. Their majorities in the other states were severely reduced. In his annual message to Congress in early December, Lincoln tried to calm the situation down. He talked about gradual emancipation, still talking about colonization, but the South didn't stop fighting. So on the 1st of January, 1863, Lincoln signed the official Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is not the law that freed the slaves. First of all, it is not a law in any way. It is, brain fart, I've forgotten the word I was looking for. It's not a law because the president issues it. The president cannot issue laws. Cannot remember that phrase now. Executive order. It's an executive order. My goodness. And it also didn't liberate all the slaves. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it only applied to a very few. The power of the Emancipation Proclamation came from the president's other title of Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military. And so the Emancipation Proclamation only deals, and only can deal, with those areas that still have some military significance. And so it exempts any state that is a part of the Union. Those states are not in any sort of military necessity. So slaves in Missouri were not freed. Slaves in Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. It is also not going to free any slave in those parts of the Confederacy that are already under Union control. So down here at the bottom of the map, southern Louisiana, thousands of slaves on those sugar plantations. Not a one of them freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. A good chunk of Tennessee is already occupied by the Union. They're not going to be freed either. It only applies to slaves living in those areas still in active rebellion. In effect, slaves in places where the Union can't actually go and free them. 3 million people in the Deep South were declared free, but since most of them were behind Confederate lines, they can't seize their freedom just yet. Now, despite its limitations, the Emancipation Proclamation set off all of these scenes of celebration across the North, among contrabands, among freedmen. A black preacher in Boston celebrated, saying that Jehovah has triumphed, his people are free. Even though it didn't free many people at all, this declaration makes the Union Army the agent of emancipation. It helps to meld the goals of union with abolition. And in that way, this proclamation doesn't end slavery, but it sounds the death knell of slavery, I guess. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the nature of the Civil War from the Union perspective. It changed the course of U.S. history, and it also represents a turning point in Lincoln's own thinking. For the first time, the proclamation says nothing about compensating slave owners or about colonizing former slaves. For the first time, it commits the Army to enlisting black soldiers. Lincoln didn't intend to be the great emancipator, but he took on that role that he felt history had thrust on him, and he did try to live up to that. Near the end of the war, some of his cabinet members said that he should rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. We don't need it anymore. Nobody has to go free. It'll make the South happy. We're going to win the war anyway, so why not be generous? And Lincoln refused to do it, having freed some people. He refuses now to send them back into bondage. He said, if I do such a thing, I should be damned in time and eternity. And the Civil War was always about slavery from the Confederate perspective. From the Union perspective, it started as a war to preserve the nation. But now it becomes this far-reaching transformation in American life and American freedom. Freed slaves will be a part of American life. A new system of labor and politics and race relations will have to replace the institution of slavery. Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, that Karl Marx, he was a keen observer of the goings-on in the United States, and when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, he wrote, "Up to now, we have witnessed only the first act of the Civil War. The second act, the revolutionary waging of war, is at hand." Of all of the provisions in the Emancipation Proclamation, few were more important than the enrollment, the enlistment of black soldiers. Free black men had been sailors since long before the war started. So when it broke out, the Secretary of the Navy already allowed black men to serve on Union warships. But they had to fight for the right to join the Army. At the beginning, the Union Army would not accept any Northern black volunteers. They were afraid that white soldiers would not be willing to fight alongside them. Lincoln was worried that accepting black soldiers would upset the border states. By the end of 61, the Army was employing contraband as cooks and laundresses and laborers, and tiny steps to enlist combat troops were taken. The white abolitionist Thomas Higginson was sent to the Sea Islands, Hilton Head, Disto Island, off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. The Union Navy took control of those islands really early in the war, and so Higginson went to enroll those slaves / former slaves / we're not actually sure what their status is right now, to enlist them in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. But it wasn't until after the Emancipation Proclamation that black recruitment began in earnest. By the end of the war, over 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army. 24,000 served in the Navy. A third of them died in battle or of wounds or disease. 15 black soldiers and 8 black sailors earned the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award for military valor. Some entire units won considerable acclaim, especially probably the most famous, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. They were a company of 3 black men from the North under the command of Robert Gould Shaw, who was a young reformer from a prominent Boston family. The 54th took part in the attack on Fort Wagner, South Carolina. Nearly half the unit died there. They helped to prove that, yes, black men can fight. They can fight bravely. The 54th and the Battle of Fort Wagner were immortalized in the film Glory, which has Denzel Washington and Ferris Bueller plays Robert Gould Shaw, and Morgan Freeman is in it too. In fact, the first action by a black soldier to win him the Medal of Honor happened by a member of the 54th at Fort Wagner. William Carney was the flag bearer for the 54th. And being a flag bearer was always a really dicey proposition, because the flag bearer was the person who, you follow the flag, right? That's how you know when to charge and when to retreat and kind of where to go. And so the enemy would always try to take out the flag bearer first. So he was shot during the battle, managed to run up to the fort and plant the flag and hold it while the rest of the 54th charged. And then when they had to retreat, he ran back to the fort, got shot twice more, and rescued the flag before he retreated also. Most black soldiers were emancipated slaves. They joined the Army as it came through the South. After Union forces seized the Mississippi Valley, General Lorenzo Thomas raised 50 complete regiments of black soldiers, 76,000 men. Another big group came from the border states, where enlistment was the only path to freedom for them. In those states, black military service severely undermined slavery, because Congress eventually expanded the Emancipation Proclamation to include every black soldier and his family. For black soldiers themselves, military service was a liberating experience. One of them wrote in 1865, "No man who's ever been a soldier can again be imposed on. They've learned what it is to be free, and they will infuse that feeling into others." Military service established men as community leaders, and it opened a door to advancement for them. The Army produced a lot of the leaders of the Reconstruction era. At least 130 former black soldiers served in elected office after the Civil War. In time, the memory of black service faded from America's collective memory. There are hundreds of Civil War monuments in the North. Fewer than a dozen have any reference to black soldiers. But well into the 20th century, it remained a point of pride in black families that their fathers and their grandfathers had fought for freedom. The Union Navy treated black sailors close to the same as white sailors. Ships back then were really small, so segregation wasn't even possible. Black and white sailors lived and ate together in the same quarters. They got equal pay. They had mostly the same promotion opportunities, except that black men could not become commissioned officers. Eventually, about 16% at least of the Civil War Navy was African American. But in the Army, completely different story. Black soldiers received treatment that was anything but equal to their white counterparts. They were organized into segregated units under white commanders who often didn't want to be commanding them. For most of the war, they received lower pay. Black privates received $10 a month. White privates got $16 a month. Black soldiers couldn't become commissioned officers until the last 5 weeks of the war. And even then, they could only become commissioned officers if they were chaplains or medical doctors. And I'll just let you think to yourself about the likelihood of a black man who can't even access college becoming a medical doctor. Black soldiers were disproportionately assigned to labor rather than to combat units. Although in a couple of cases that did come from kind of worry on the part of white commanders that Confederate troops would treat black soldiers much more brutally if they were captured, which was absolutely true. The most notorious case of brutality was the Fort Pillow Massacre. 600 Union forces held Fort Pillow, Tennessee, against 2,000 Confederates, and when the Confederates broke the line, the soldiers inside surrendered. And then the Confederates massacred almost all of the black troops. The white troops they took prisoner, but they killed more than 200 surrendering black troops. The Confederates were commanded by General Nathan Bedford Forrest, which, if you watched Forrest Gump, which I realize now is kind of an old movie to you, you will know that Nathan Bedford Forrest goes on to be the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. So he's just a violent a-hole his entire life. Still, with the restrictions and with the brutality and with all of these things, black soldiers played a crucial role, certainly in winning the war, and also in helping to define what the war is about. Frederick Douglass strongly encouraged young men to enlist. He said, once you get the brass letters U.S. on your uniform, no power on earth can deny that you've earned the right to citizenship. Thanks in part to this military service, many politicians in the last couple years of the war came to believe that emancipation needed to also bring equal protection of the law, regardless of race. One of the first acts of Congress to recognize that equal protection idea was in granting retroactive equal back pay to black soldiers in early '65. This, by no means, eliminated racism from national life. But many black men, especially soldiers and their families, believed that the war had taken a government for white men and turned it into a government for mankind. But the service of black troops affected Lincoln's own outlook. He insisted that a soldier is a soldier, and they must be treated the same when they're captured. When the Confederates wouldn't include African Americans in the prisoner of war exchanges, Lincoln cut the program entirely. In '64, Lincoln, who had never, ever supported black voting rights, in '64, he urged the governor of Louisiana to give at least partial suffrage to African American men, especially to black soldiers. A black man who lived in California wrote in 1862 that the old things are passing away, and eventually the old prejudices must follow. The revolution has begun, and time alone must tell where it is to end. The changing status of black Americans was just one example of what some historians call the Second American Revolution, this transformation of American government and American society brought about by the Civil War. The different definitions of freedom were never more important than during this war. Lincoln said, "We all declare that we're for freedom, but in using the same word, we don't all mean the same thing." He said that to the North, freedom means free labor. It is the work that a free man does. Every man enjoys the fruits of his own labor. But to the South, to Southern whites, especially the ones in power, freedom meant mastership. It meant enjoying the fruits of someone else's labor. When the Union won the war, it should have meant that the Northern understanding of freedom became the national norm. And to some extent, that did happen. The attack on Fort Sumter, for Northerners, that crystallized the difference between freedom and slavery that abolitionists have been talking about for decades. And I realize that hearing that phrase in the 21st century sounds bizarre. Of course, there's a difference between freedom and slavery. But remember, so many people still believed in that hierarchical idea of freedom, that there is your status, that some people have an inborn right to exercise more power and more privilege than others. Now that idea is supposed to go away. It doesn't entirely, obviously, but it is supposed to be weakened. And union and liberty became synonymous. Just like during the Revolution, like religious meanings of freedom and secular meanings of freedom started to kind of merge and blend, and you probably all heard the battle hymn of the Republic. And mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. In like the second or third verse, it says, "As Christ died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." And emancipation offered proof that the U.S. was progressive and had this holy destiny. The Chicago Tribune wrote that because of emancipation, the U.S. could truly exist as our fathers designed it, the home of freedom, the asylum of the oppressed, the seat of justice. But it was Abe himself who linked the war to the deepest beliefs of Northern society. Lincoln summarized his concept of the war and the meaning of the war in November of 1863, when he gave some very brief remarks at the dedication of a military cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Gettysburg Address is considered his finest speech. It's less than 3 minutes long. And in those 3 minutes, he identified the United States with the principle that all men are created equal. He spoke of the war as bringing about a new birth of freedom, and he defined the essence of a good government as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But this new vision of the United States, this new nation state that we're creating, had greatly expanded powers and responsibilities. The U.S. remained a federal republic, with power divided between the feds and the states. But the war created a new national self-consciousness, and people started to use the word nation, where before they would have used the word union, as in a union of the several states. When Lincoln took office in 61, in his inaugural speech, he used the word union 20 times. The union must be preserved. The union must be defended. He never used the word nation. But in the Gettysburg Address in 63, just 2 years later, Lincoln referred to the nation 5 times in 3 minutes. He didn't use the word union at all. And you'll have a very hard time finding any public speech after that point where he refers to the union instead of the nation. But this intense new nationalism made it hard to criticize the war effort or any of Lincoln's policies. It started to seem treasonous. The Civil War had to face the issue of wartime dissent, like we do every time there's a war. And in general, we didn't handle it very well. According to the New York Times, the safety of the nation must be the supreme law, not civil liberties. Thousands of people were arrested, including newspaper editors and Democratic politicians and people who discouraged enlistment in the Army, and one poor dude up in Chicago who was arrested for calling the president a damned fool. I mean, who hasn't? The Constitution is a little unclear on when and how and by whom the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended, which would allow them to hold a prisoner indefinitely without charge. So Lincoln decided, since there's a war on, habeas corpus can be suspended now and by him. He said that was a presidential war power, and he did it twice for those who were accused of being disloyal. And the courts kind of didn't do anything about it. Roger Taney is still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and we all know that Taney doesn't actually care what the Constitution says. So the court does not intervene when a military court convicted a civilian of treason because that civilian had given some anti-war speeches. Lincoln banished that dude, Clement Vallandigham, banished him to the Confederacy, who didn't want him either. In 1961, Taney did order Lincoln to release a civilian who had been arrested by military police in a different incident, but Lincoln ignored it. It wasn't until 1866, when the war was over and Lincoln was dead, that the court said, oh, gosh, I guess that was all unconstitutional. Now, in practice, Lincoln wasn't super tyrannical. Most of the civilians who were arrested were pretty quickly released. The Democratic press continued to publish throughout the war. Free elections continued to be held. But the policies of the Lincoln administration proved that civil liberties can be pretty fragile during a war. All right, we're going to stop this here, and then we're going to record part 2 later.